I'm James Claiborne, Public Programming Manager at the African American Museum in Philadelphia. I'd like to welcome you to our monthly midday art talk called ArtBreak. This is a time that the museum features highlights our exhibitions, some of the work of our curatorial staff. Typically, this would have happened in our galleries. We'd be looking at you face to face, but we're so excited to be with you virtually. Moving our programs into a virtual space has afforded us the opportunity to look wide and deep and pull in some folks who are part of our work throughout the year and throughout the years. We're very happy to be here with a great friend of the museum, pillar of the Philadelphia cultural scene, Betty Leacraft. And so you'll hear a little bit more from Betty in just a few moments, but I'd like to thank you for being here. Before we get into our program, which will open with a presentation by Betty Leacraft, I just want to tell you a little bit more about the artist we're featuring today. Betty Leacraft, a resident of Philadelphia, is a shapeshifter of textile, presenter, and curator. As a former teaching artist specializing in fiber arts and related textile forms, she led many workshops and residencies in the tri-state area: colleges, public schools, libraries, prisons, senior centers, women's shelters, reentry, and substance abuse programs. Betty's contemporary artworks have been included in prestigious exhibitions regionally, nationally, and internationally. Selected venues include the International Quilt Convention in Africa, Johannesburg, South Africa, the Day Center for the Study of Contemporary Art in Ghana, West Africa, the Museo de Arte Moderna in Bahia, Brazil, the Leeway Foundation, the Reginald Lewis Museum of Maryland, the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center in Ohio, the Mint Museum of Craft and Design in North Carolina, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, and other institutions, including the African American Museum in Philadelphia. Betty's artworks and community-based projects have appeared in independent and documentary films. Her contemporary art quilts are featured in 5 books authored by Dr. Carolyn L. Mazzalumi, founder of the internationally recognized Women of Color Quilters Network. From 1980 to 86, she was employed by the Fabric Workshop Museum here in Philadelphia as the fabric construction technician, engineering sewn constructions of artist proofs and editions for world-renowned artists in residence. Betty has received numerous awards, honors, and grants, including multiple awards from the Leeway Foundation, 5 Leeway Foundation Art and Change grants, 2 Leeway Window of Opportunity Awards, and the Leeway Transformation Awards. We're so happy to have Betty here with us. And right now, I'd like to turn over the program to Betty. Betty, thank you so much for being here. We're so happy.
Thank you, James. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm very honored to be a part of this program. And I'd like to welcome everyone who has taken the time to tune in when you could be eating lunch or something else like that. So what we're going to do is just start right in. On the title page, I'm standing in front of a larger hand-dyed work of mine that's called White Blossom. What we're going to do is we're really going to take a journey through my development from the time of the Fabric Workshop, which was 1980 to 86, coming forward to where I am now. And the reason we're starting at the Fabric Workshop is because it was an artistic crossroads for me, in that all of my experience before that was with garment making and garment design. And so I got a chance to be able to put all of that skill to work, constructing and engineering the projects for artists in residence who were stepping out of their medium, whatever it was, to experiment with textile printing. So once that cloth came off the table, it was my job to turn it into whatever it was they wanted. And I'll just say here that that was at a very early point in the Fabric Workshop's development, because the one domestic machine And the one industrial machine I had to use to do everything is now an entire department with specialized moving parts. So the book that you see there is the first book that was published about the fabric workshop, and it contains many of the projects that I had to help bring to fruition in terms of what the artists wanted. One of the artists that I had the pleasure of working with is Philadelphia's own Mo Brooker. And you see him, myself in the green hat, and the late, great master printer, Robert Smith, who was in charge of everything that had to be printed, along with two other assistants. And what we're doing is we're looking over what has happened in terms of where Mo wanted to have different color placement for the bars that you see on the right, which are the finished quilt. And you might need to know that that quilt was made in time for his wedding to the late Cheryl McClinney Brooker. So I would call that their wedding quilt. But what it also did too was it got me in the mode of making quilts, which I wasn't doing before coming to the fabric workshop. Next. The slide that you see here is one that I'm just so glad to have documentation of. This is the day that Betty Saar had come, and her fabric was printed, and it had come back from the finisher's silk fabric that she had designed, along with the fabric that you see on the right-hand side for a duvet cover. She had two different ones, but this is the one that I chose. But the fact that I have a photograph standing next to this great lady who I had admired for so long, to be right there in her presence was something. And this is 1984. So this is not a new slide, which, well, you should be able to see from that to then, the face has changed over here. You're seeing the beginnings of me making quilt forms for other artists, but not on my own yet. Now, this is the first quilt that I made upon the transition of my mother. She passed in 2003 on Mother's Day. So that was pretty traumatic. And there was a long period of time when I was just not able to call up my creative spirit because of that loss. But when I did, I decided I wanted to do as much surface design as possible to make my work as original as possible. So this one is called Ascending Spirits, and it was made with her in mind. You can see hands that are reaching up. And if I had a detail, which I don't, down at the bottom, there are metallic threads that are configured in such a way that they look almost like the constellation in the sky. I call them thread maps because I imagined them as a roadmap for ancestors to find their way to their realm in the great beyond. And that piece is also in the Museum of Michigan University's Department of Quilt Index, along with many other quilts that are from the Women of Color Quilters Network. Surface design development. I had always had an interest in how you get designs on cloth. But once I was able to come through the fabric workshop after being there for 6 years, I got to see so many different ways of doing that. And I carried that forward from 1986 through other periods where I was dibbling and dabbling with dyeing and other kinds of surface design methods. But once I was able to stretch out on my own, I started to do things that put color over the whole cloth, which you see on the right. I'm rolling up experimental dye pieces that I did when I was at Temple's Fiber and Material Studies Department, working on my own work. And on the left, that is actually the subtraction of color, which is called discharge. So instead of putting color in, you are taking color out. And as you can see on that black t-shirt, there are a number of patterns that I created by putting down various kinds of tape and then applying an agent that would discharge the color from the cloth. Essentials in my work, one of them is ironing. And it's just like people who are used to making clothing or do it as a profession, you know that the ironing makes the difference in the outcome. So even though I'm ironing a length of cloth that was dyed by some children, I'm making sure that those edges lay flat because they're going to go on display. And what you're seeing in the background is a community dyed piece of cloth that was done by about 4 or 6 people. And right beside it is actually one of the borders on the quilt that is behind me. Now, on the left is a very large piece that I did, and most of my dyeing is improvisational folding, twisting, and tying. I'm not trying to do it in a prescribed way because I like the element of surprise in working in that way. This is called White Blossoms, and what you can see is a stylized version of white flowers on the left. I didn't know it was going to come out that way, but when I saw it, that's when I gave it its title. Some of the other things I've done with dyeing, on the right, you see a variety of scarves in different methods of dyeing, some full immersion, some direct dyeing by squeezing dye directly on the scarf, which is the case with the 2 smaller ones, or what is called low immersion dyeing, which is the case with those 2 that are larger in the middle, which just means that you're putting it in a small container with a minimum amount of water. On the left-hand side is one of the newer quilts that I made last year that is from a piece that I had kept around for a long time and finally got around to making it up. This particular quilt is called a mandala, and it was shown in South Africa for a show that the Women of Color Quilters Network participated in. And I chose the colors of the ANC flag to make point for my piece. So all of those quadrants that are in the center, the 4 quadrants, are actually mini ANC flags that are turned around and configured so that the Black bands connect, which symbolizes the unity of Black people under apartheid and coming out from under it, still having that unity. The zigzag designs in the outer borders were my inspiration from Zulu beaded jewelry, which has a lot of zigzag design elements in it. And all of the colors that you see there were sponge painted with 3 different colors of yellow, which represented the changes of yellow in the ANC flag through the years, which I found out during my research. Some of the other things that I'm getting to do now, and this would have been 2019 when this was taken, pre-COVID, was to start to be able to print my own fabric. And what you're seeing is a proof of a design that I made. And I was ready to keep that going, but COVID stepped in and all of that had to be shut down. So I plan to go back to this once things are a little bit safer, but this is another way of pointing up the different kinds of processes that I'm engaged with that go beyond just sewing. Another process that came to me that I was not expecting was felt making. And during the period of time my mother passed, I joined the Philadelphia Guild of Hand Weavers, expecting to learn to weave. But what I found out was that weaving was not going to be my forte, but felt making was, because the first felt making class I took with Master Felter, the late Marish Krasnogor, and Christina White, I think is her name. After I fell into that, I started realizing that I could use wool fiber basically to paint and create an original textile. So what you need to understand with felting is that you are manipulating wool, either dyed or undyed, and you're using pressure and moisture and heat to create a textile. If you think of a person who wears their hair in locks, which I don't call dread, I call them locks, that is a way of understanding felting in terms of one's hair. If you are of African descent and your hair is of that texture, it's basically felting together. And that's what happens with sheep's wool. So this particular piece is one that is in another book of Carolyn Maslumi's called Textural Rhythms, because it's a jazz theme. So of course I could say a whole lot about this, but we have a lot more to get through. And one of the symbols that reoccur in my work, if you look on the right, you'll see a yellow stylized cowrie shell. And that is usually there to denote some sort of connection to Africa or the Africa diaspora. And since this particular piece is dedicated to a jazz theme, those shells had to be there. Another thing that I was learning pre-COVID was how to do digital embroidery. And I was at a makerspace that had a Brother digital embroidery machine. So it was really great to learn that process, because it would help me to be able to do even more within my own work to bring about different enhancements. So what you see on the left is a design that was already in the memory of the machine. And I'm watching it to see when the outline stitches go down, when the fill-in stitches go down, so that if I wanted to change color, I would know when to stop the machine and add a new color. And on the right, what you're seeing is the results of me doing exactly that, finding out when the machine is going to another design element and knowing when to change the color. So if you look at those spans, you can see that the background of the fan is one color, the blossoms and the limbs that the blossoms are held on are a different color, and then the base of the fan is yet another color. So there's a lot to learn to do with that, especially if you're programming in your own designs, which is something I'm still learning to do. One of the special projects that I was in 2017 was called Philadelphia Assembled. And what it was art and civic engagement in a collaborative sense, in the way of telling a story of radical community building and active resistance. And this project was started by Gina von Heiswick, who was a guest artist at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. There were so many moving parts to this project, I can't begin to tell you, but the one that I was involved in was called Reconstructions. And we had a site on 4th near Master where an actual structure of an affordable house was put up, but just the frame of the house. And that's where we held our meetings. The quilt that you see here, called Kensington Memories, was commissioned especially for that project. And it consisted of several maps. The one on the left side was 1926, which actually had a key to show the demographics ethnically of the makeup of Philadelphia. The two on the right, the one at the top was a pre-1900s map of Philadelphia, and the one below was, I believe, 1926. So the thing that was interesting was people seeing these quilts, this quilt and the maps, and looking for their grandparents' houses or their other family members' houses, because this is all the Kensington area. And all of the images that you see surrounding were from the special part of the library at Temple that had urban archives. So what I did was I looked for photographs that would tell a chronology of what went on in Kensington. And the best way for me to do that was to look for some that had cars in them or even clothing, something that when you looked at it, you knew this is an earlier period of time, or this is a more recent period of time. I didn't know that there had been an annual baby parade in Kensington until I started looking through these archives. Now, what I'm going to do is take you backward in the process of how that quilt got to be. What you see on the left is the wide format Epson printer that the skilled technician, Gwendolyn Anderson, who basically runs that area of the Jefferson University's surface design department. So that is the wide format printer where the images were printed, and you can see me holding up the images as they came out, and I had cut some of them apart so that I could, see how much space was between, because I had already asked for a certain amount of space between each image, which would accommodate my sewing margin. What you see now on the right is me beginning to assemble some of those pieces, deciding what the layout is going to be. And on the left, I am cutting out all of the strips that were going to divide the images that you saw in the previous slide with the quilt already made up. There was a lot of layout to be done, and always with layout, there's switching around. This quilt actually grew beyond what I thought it was going to, so I had to make it in 2 separate pieces and join it so that it didn't look that way. So where you see me working is actually a room in the Community Education Center, CEC, by the good graces of Terry Shockley. So we made arrangements so that I could use that room actually in between classes. I would come in the morning and I would work an hour before classes or some other activity was going to begin, break down everything, and then come back after the classes had finished, set up, sometimes work through the night or come back early in the morning. So it was an interesting situation, because if I didn't have a space this big, that quilt really would not have happened. So a great debt of thanks to Terry Shockley. Again, I am working on that quilt. You can see me working on my sewing machine, which I have nicknamed Betty Leacraft. I had to give it a last name because my quilting sister, Dinga McCannon, also has a Bernina. And when I went to her house one day, we found out that we both had named our Berninas Bernie. So to distinguish mine from hers, mine is Betty Leacraft. So you can see me sewing some of those red divider strips on the right, and on the left, what you are doing is you're seeing a very sharp close-up of me sewing and doing a quilting technique that I really embrace called stitching in the ditch. And stitching in the ditch means that you are putting stitching basically within the area where the 2 seams come together. And with stitching in the ditch, you can hide that stitching depending on the color thread that you are using. Because when I do quilting on a quilt, I'm more concerned with the image and the narrative than how much quilting design I can get in the background. So when I do stitching in the ditch, I am fulfilling the requirement of a quilt being a quilt, which is stitching that goes through all 3 layers, but my stitching is not always obvious. What you're seeing here is the quilt when it was delivered, and what had to happen was at the top part, closer to the screen, the casing that was going to accommodate the rod that would hold the quilt up wherever it was exhibited still had to be hand sewn down. So you can see the white part of that. And what I wanted was for you to get an idea of the size and the scale of the quilt, because it's about, I think it's 69 inches across and 81 inches long. So it's a pretty big piece. Along with showing that quilt at the Philadelphia Assembled exhibition, which consisted of many people across Philadelphia from all walks of creativity and life. One of the things that I wanted to be sure happened was something that highlighted those who did fiber or other kind of fiber related works within the body of that huge collective exhibition. So the Textiles as social commentary was what I thought of. So each of the women that you see sitting at that table had something in the exhibition that was fiber or textile related. And luckily, Philly Cam came out and documented that afternoon because I was a member of Philly Cam. And some of the social commentary that may be visible would be the fabric hanging across the front of the table, two of them which were printed in Africa that celebrated President Obama upon becoming president and also visiting those particular countries, and the one in the middle, which shows Nelson Mandela. And I put them together because they were the first presidents of their kind in their nation, with Nelson Mandela being the first president with a democratic election. And of course, President Obama being the first president of African descent in the United States. And all the other fabrics that are hanging up are from my personal collection from different countries. And they were there because they related in some way to what we were talking about. You see on the left, Michelle Angela Ortiz in the white blouse, myself in the middle, and then Anula Shetty. We were a team, which Michelle Angela Ortiz assembled for a commission to do an installation that would celebrate the Leeway Foundation turning 25 years old. I was really so pleased to be asked into this project because I had a great respect for both of the artists with whom I would be working. Now, Michelle Angela Ortiz was the team leader. No better person to be that because she's highly organized, not only in her own artwork, but as an administrator. And I mean, she ran a very tight ship. And we all got along really well. There were no sticking points. There were no arguments. I mean, it was a dream come true. So what you're seeing in the background of that slide, where the both of us, all three of us are, is part of Michelle Angela Ortiz's work, because she painted those pods that you see and the hand that looks like it's holding. And it's actually supposed to be a seed pod. And you can see what looks like lips in one of those pods. So all of that lighting and projection is the domain of Anula Shetty, who is a very accomplished, award-winning media specialist and filmmaker. And Michelle Angela Ortiz, on top of being a top flight administrator, is a muralist par excellence. I mean, when you see the size and the scale of some of the things that she's done, it's really massive and wonderful, wonderful work that deals with social issues that are so large in their scope, you know, that is right in your face. You cannot skirt the issue that she is championing at the time that she does her works. What you're doing is you're going backward in time for getting that piece ready. There was a lot of yardage that had to be dyed, and Temple's Dye Lab is a state-of-the-art department, and there was arrangements made for me to be able to do everything I needed to do on my end with dyeing the fabric at the Tyler School of Art Department of Fiber and Material Studies. So on the left, you see me holding up cloth that I'm rinsing, and I'm talking, you know, 6 or more yards at a time I was working with in dyeing. And what people don't understand is it takes a lot more to dye a solid piece of cloth than it does to create pattern, because you're constantly moving the cloth around in the water for the first 20 minutes of the dye bath to make sure that all areas receive the same amount of color. So it's very physical work. The gloves I am wearing are not the longest ones that I had to use. I had others that came clear up to my armpits, similar to what a veterinarian who's examining a cow, if I can use that reference, would be using. And no project is going to be complete that's that scope unless you have a good assistant. And on the right, you see my assistant, Kira Rodriguez, who did not have any fiber background, but fell into it like a duck in water. We got along really well. And on my description, I said, must be able to bend and stoop easily. So this person is in their 20s. And of course, they could do something that was becoming more difficult for me, which was a lot of bending and stooping. So I am really, really very, very pleased to have had Kira Rodriguez as an incredible lab assistant. Now, coming into the actual space at Moore College of Art front window gallery to get the work underway, you can see Michelle on a ladder doing painting. And what you're seeing is the hand that's holding the seed pod in outline form. And then on the right-hand side, you can see where she has painted it in, as well as the color that the seed pods were going to be. Now, Anula, who has her hands stretched up, is giving instruction to Monica Cooter, who is on the installation team, as to the placement of the projectors, because there were several projectors. And one of the terms that I learned in all of this was video mapping. And video mapping is the ability of the media person or projectionist to actually get what is going to be shown within a specific shape. So it's only within that shape and not outside of it. So it was Anula's job to make sure that those images that went within the seed pods were placed correctly, because the placement of the projection equipment was where she needed it to be. And over on the right-hand side, you can see those pieces that I dyed hung up, and there is a double set. So the ones that you see facing you, there is another set behind. And you can see part of that above Monica's head in that pale yellow and a peach color. So even though it's deceptively simple looking, there was a lot of work that went into getting that fabric not only colored the way that it was, but cut into the strips that needed to be cut, getting them all sewn, and making sure that they fit the armature correctly, telling the person they had to do the armature, what length it needed to be, and then of course the Moore team installing them at the levels that they were supposed to be seen. So what you can see on the left is the installation team measuring from the floor up, so that that particular tier is hung at the proper length. And over on the right is yours truly. And I put that slide in so you could get an idea of the scale. And you also can see the two colors within each tier that had to be dyed. And what I need to tell you is there was a whole operation just making sure that the lighter color that was dyed was sectioned off with plastic and sealed, so that when the darker color was dyed, there wasn't any backwash. So there are a whole lot of process slides that are not here that show all of that, but I'm just telling it to you at this point. What you're seeing is a picture that was taken from the outside by Michelle through the window once the installation went up, and this was taken at night. All the projectors were going, and the projector images changed. And all of those strips that were hanging down were also alluding to the presence of ancestors, because one of the things that this installation was honoring were also leeway grantees and awardees who had passed on. Now, what you'll see on the floor, which looks like a diagonal kind of crisscross design, was something unexpected we didn't even know was going to happen. So as a result of the light from the projections shining through the separations in the hanging tiers and strips of fabric, this additional pattern was made on the floor. None of us knew that was going to happen, but it was certainly a welcome addition. So sometimes there are some things that occur that you don't even know are going to happen until the end. Now, other images that appeared in those seed pods, which you don't see here, were images of poets from the area who were reciting the Leeway poem. And when that poem was being recited, some of the changes of imagery within those seed pods showed each of those poets, notably Tripita Mason, Ursula Rucker, and the fabulous Sonia Sanchez. And if I'm leaving out anybody, please forgive me because I have to go on to the next slide. What you're seeing here is the latest of one of my works. So I was wanting to embrace the topic of lynching for a long time, but I kept putting it off because it's a very traumatic topic to me. I sent for some books from the lynching memorial that is down in Alabama to just get some additional background information. I knew what images I wanted to do. So on the right-hand side, I wanted a quilt that was more simple in design as opposed to chocked full of narrative images, because the act of lynching, I needed to stand out, and I didn't want to do it by way of depicting bodies swinging from trees, because that's the obvious. I wanted to do something that would cause people to ask more questions. And one of the things that I know will probably get questions is, why are those fingers in the green and the red quadrants? And the reason is, the ones in the red, they are actually pointing to the POC, which is people of color, because BIPOC hadn't occurred yet, or else I would have put it in that way, in case somebody wants to correct me. You're getting the explanation now. So those fingers are actually pointing to people of color, symbolized by POC. And there are two eyes, one next to the P and one next to the C. Those are the eyes of those who had suffered such a fate. And coming down to the middle of the quilt is the raised fist of solidarity or resistance, depending on what you're doing at the time with that. And in the wrist and palm area of that fist is an Adinkra symbol, which is not one of those that is very widely used, but is one that symbolizes unity. On the right-hand side is an open hand, which was inspired by a protective amulet that I know in terms of Islamic tradition and worship is called the Hand of Fatima. People who are Jewish would call such a protective amulet Hamsa, but this one was being used in the context of Hand of Fatima, and it's a stylized hand. And in the middle of the palm is another Adinkra symbol, which deals with protection. Now down at the bottom in the green quadrants, those fingers are pointing to perpetrators within the United States of America who carried out the heinous crime of lynching from the end of enslavement, and even probably during enslavement, up until the present day. And the eyes that you see there are the eyes that represent those who were the perpetrators of such acts, and especially those who were onlookers, who were there for sport. Because some people don't know that back in the day, that hangings were almost planned activities. People would come with picnic baskets. They would come with children. There were postcards that were made, that were sent around. And some of them I have seen, and it was a horrible type of thing to see such a heinous act be depicted almost in a carnival type atmosphere. And to take it further, there were people who would actually pull off appendages or cut off appendages of the deceased to keep as a souvenir. So that is another reason those fingers are in this quilt, because it's also talking about those things that were taken away from these dead, abused bodies, abusing them even further. Ears, fingers. And, it's a horrible thing to think about. And on the right, what you're seeing is a little closer view of both of those the open hand and the fist, and you're seeing a little bit closer view of those symbols, which is one of the first things I did when I started to do design on my own on the embroidery machine. So the colors are very significant. People know that the black, red, and green is part of the Black national flag, which is used not only in the United States, but in the diaspora. I just carried those colors over to the embroidered aspect of this piece. And all of the stitching that I did is stitching in a ditch, because at the time that this piece was photographed, I hadn't done the background stitching in the red and green quadrants. But the stitching that I did was highly irregular, very angular. None was the same from one block to the next, because I was trying to create what I called trauma lines, meaning that if you're dealing with a subject like this, it's hard to think of regulated emotions, regulated thinking, because I tried to put myself in the shoes of the person who was being led to the noose. And just the thought of it meant that that stitching was going to be anything but regular. So I called that particular stitching that was in that quilt, which would be seen by those who go to the exhibition, I call that trauma line quilt stitching. This is the format of how the Textile Center wanted us to put out anything that would be PR in our own areas. And I would like to add here that in this exhibition, Racism in the Face of Hate We Resist, are other quilters from Philadelphia, and I'll name them quickly. Michelle Flamer, who's a member of the Women of Color Quilters Network. Christina Johnson, a very well-known master quilter here in Philadelphia, and a doll maker, a master doll maker, Gloria Davis, who ventured into quilt making to be a part of this particular exhibition. Now, as I said before, the 7 exhibitions came under the title, We Are the Story. This is actually the last of the 7 exhibitions in this great, what can I say, blanketing of the city that Dr. Mazlumi did, because all of these 7 exhibitions were in different venues. And what she wanted to do was to basically blanket the city with quilt narrative information dealing with the issues at hand, because the Textile Center is in the city where George Floyd was murdered. So I understand there's been very great responses to all of these quilt narratives, because Racism in the Face of Hate was a juried exhibition that was opened to international participation. So there's a total of 63 quilts in this exhibition, and they are all the same size, 36 by 36. And the reason for that is if this exhibition travels, it will be easy to pack and afford to ship everything that fits within the same container. So I'm really pleased to be a part of this exhibition, especially with the subject matter that is being addressed, and very, very proud to be a longstanding member of the Women of Color Quilters Network, which was founded by Dr. Carolyn Mazlumi. And I can safely say that my participation in her exhibitions is what gave me a more national and international exposure, because with all of her exhibitions is a beautiful hard or soft cover book. So there is one that will be coming up for the We Are the Story exhibitions. I can't wait to see it. The one that is more recent is called Visioning Human Rights, and the quilt that is behind me is in that book, which we can get to a little later to be able to see that quilt, which is behind me.
Thank you, Betty. That was just really incredible. It's a beautiful thing to witness. I'm thinking about your practice and the way that your experience as a textile artist and as a quilter is a lived experience. You're stitching together so many communities and histories, and it's just wonderful to witness. You said something really brilliant. You said there are some things that happen that you don't know are going to occur until the end. And I thought that was just a beautiful mantra for life. And I'm going to hold that with me. Maybe we can, you walked us through such a beautiful timeline. Maybe we can go back. And I just think it's beautiful to think about the way that making is generational. We've seen a lot of transfer of information in your collaborations, but I believe some of your earliest collaborations were with family members. So muse a little bit about your grandmother and sort of your earliest days as a maker.
Okay, well, I'm going to hold her picture up because this picture is also in the quilt behind me. But she was basically my first art teacher. And the thing that is interesting about it is she was the one that always encouraged me when someone would say, oh, that's good on the side. She was always the one that encouraged me because her mother was a professional dressmaker. And the story goes that when her mother's legs were tired from using a treadle machine, if you don't know what a treadle machine is, look it up because you're using your feet to power the needle going up and down by moving your feet back and forth. So when my great grandmother's legs would get tired, my grandmother told me it was her job to get stooped down there as a little girl and push that plate and keep it going. A deadline is a deadline. It doesn't matter the period of history. If Miss Ruby is supposed to have her white dress for Women's Day, then it needs to be ready when it's supposed to be ready. So my grandmother grew up with a maker who did that as a profession. And as a result, she was the person that introduced me to making things, all kinds of things.
So let's move from there into collaboration, your collaboration with your grandmother and you being a part of her process. It was really amazing to see these in process shots of you really, in the office making these gorgeous and deeply moving final products that have been shown around the world. What does collaboration do for you as an artist, and why is that something that's important to your practice?
What collaboration did was help me to step out of working as a solitary person, that I only had to think of what I wanted. I had to work within the broader context of where my skill intersects with a filmmaker, with a muralist, and all of us talking together. There was a lot of planning that went into this, a lot of pre-meetings and things like that, because there were supposed to be maybe 3 colors in those tiers. And realistically, for how the original rendering that Michelle Angela Ortiz did, it was going to be more difficult to try to do that. So we scaled that down to 2. So there were things that had to be talked about, and whatever needed to be readjusted was readjusted. And budget was very interesting because I always put forth my dream budget. I don't put in a scaled back budget. I put in the full shoot match. And that if it is scaled back, I'm still not going to suffer, you know. And it was very wonderful. The Leeway Foundation was generous. We got our full budget. Everything that we needed to do got done. And we got to know each other in a different way because I had never worked with these 2 artists before, but I had admired them greatly, greatly. I met Michelle during the time she worked for the Bartol Foundation, running the artist workshops. And Anula, I just always knew her name and wanted to take her introductory course for people who wanted to learn how to make a little documentary, and there was always a conflict. And I told her, I said, well, you know, it's brought us to this point. I'm still not in your class, but I'm getting to do something which I hadn't imagined, which would be working along with you and Michelle on what turned out to be a highly successful installation. So I really enjoyed working with them. But see, everybody had the same level of skill and the same kind of work habits. And that is important. And the other thing in working with collaborative process is you can't go ahead on your own and do something maybe you want to do without bringing it back to your collaborators and talking about it. Everyone has to be on the same page all along the way. The only way you're not doing that is when you're doing something that only Anula Shetty as a filmmaker can do, or only Michelle Angela Ortiz can do as a muralist, or me as the person who was doing, you know, all of the dye work. So when we were working within our separate expertise, of course, you know, you go on and do what you do. But when it's time to come together, or if there is a question, then you have a conference in person or on the phone.
Oh yeah, we're
Yeah,
raising.
I'm moving it up a little bit just so that they can see that quilt, and you can see that my grandmother's face is up in that quadrant. And I would like to say just a little tiny thing.
Yeah.
What you see behind me are documents for a copyright for a label for a hair pomade that she made when I was a little girl, because at the time it was a female-headed household. So with my grandfather and grandmother's divorce, that meant a major chunk of money was leaving the household. So my grandmother made this pomade, this hair pomade, and got a copyright for her label that went on these little tins, maybe about the size of this compact, maybe about that deep. And the top of the tin had paper, which I moistened, and it was my job as a little girl to put those labels on. And when she would make this pomade, it was my job to stir that vat while she dropped different things in. The only ingredient I can remember is oil of bergamot, which I find is in a lot of Black hair care products, for which those of us who come from that part and oil the scalp tradition, we know that is in there. But I was helping in a process that was bringing income into what was a female-headed household. Plus, I would go around with her to the hair salons when she would drop this stuff off for whoever it was that had an order. And I love going around with her because the hair salons, they always had stuff to eat. Well, you want something, baby? Yes, ma'am. I was ready. And it was wonderful going around with my grandmother because there was always something going on, you know, even going with her to church. She didn't go to deadbeat churches. You know, when you got in there, you were praising for days. The music was good, the singing was good, and the preaching was good. So, you know, hanging out with Nanny as a young child was quite something. And that's probably why we don't have a lot of family pictures, because she told me I would find scissors wherever she put them. And I would open up the album and start whacking on pictures. I'm not sure. I said, I guess I was trying to tell you something then, but you know, no one was ready to hear it yet.
I want to say thank you, and I want to thank, and remember your grandmother for setting you on a course and teaching you skills that would pique your curiosity. I'm grateful for you cracking open your archives and making them available to the museum and to this audience here. The
colors that are in this quilt are basically a lot of colors she liked. She liked pink and she liked orchid, like what I have on.
Yeah.
And so, you know, color symbolism in my work shows up in various ways. So a lot of the coloring in this piece is representative of colors she liked, and all of the dyed strips, with the exception of these, were ones that I had actually dyed myself.
Well, that was a question that we had on the table, which was, your work is so vibrant, and and as well as being kind of improvisational, you are discovering things along the way that, the improvisation, it does not necessarily indicate a lack of specificity. And so I know you are particular in your process. And so I'm wondering, how are you approaching color, knowing that you're laying out a very detailed process, but also leaving some room for what the work wants to say and do.
Well, sometimes it depends on what the work is going to be for, because in Carolyn Maslumi's exhibition, you have a theme, and under that theme may be several topics. So in a context like that, I'm going to be thinking about, okay, how is this going to figure into what I am going to do? And since I was dealing with my grandmother in this, and this is from the Visioning Human Rights book, and the human right as stipulated by the United Nations that I chose was copyright.
Mhm.
So it was a way for me to embrace the theme because I've got the documents, but also embrace color symbolism by way of a personal preference of the person who is being honored in the quilt. Some other things might be spiritual in nature, or from a topic such as jazz. That's where improvisation comes in for me, because I'm a jazz fan from my early teenage years. And so the idea of improvisation, I was able to put it into my work in a way that I love, because I'm always dealing with the element of surprise with that.
Our dear friend Karen Smith is asking about purple and what purple signifies. I think you talked a little bit about your grandmother's favorite color. She's asking, is this your favorite color?
Well, it became my favorite color as I went along on the road of life, shall we say. And I'm not sure when it emerged, but it did. Various shades of purple. I'm particular about the shades of purple I wear. I will wear the brighter shades. My grandmother would have called this orchid. Okay, so orchid. Also, if I'm looking at a diaspora meaning from one African diaspora place to another, researching what colors mean within the context of that culture, or within a spiritual context, maybe. And color is also something that I deal with every day, because I don't know when this started. There was a color assigned to every day of the week. Now, the late great Corbett Banks was the one that hit me to that. And I can't remember where he got it from, but it would be the same color. Just like today is Thursday is purple.
Yeah.
All right, so I've got that on. And if you don't see it outward, it's underneath somewhere.
Yeah.
But the symbolism for color is very great with me, because it's also a way to communicate. We use it every day. If you come to a stop sign, it's red, and you're supposed to stop. It gives direction, So color is something that I used when I was teaching. Color symbolism was very big and high on the agenda, because it gave people who were had difficulty verbalizing what they meant to use color and assign meaning to it and create a language in that way. Is that apple pie, Karen Smith? I assume. And everybody needs to know her vegan apple pies are the best. You look on Instagram, and if you see something, you get in touch with her. And it's important to support artists, especially now, because the same level of income is not happening. And I made a list of 10 artists whom I had been able to get something from them, even if it was only $10, because I got a sticker from the great renowned potter, Roberto Lugo, who was on To Tell the Truth recently.
Yeah.
And I feel it's important to do what you can. If you spend $10, $15 in Starbucks, there's an artist that has something.
Yeah, I think you are speaking to it's one of the reasons I love working in Philadelphia and this sector. It is evident in the presentation you've done earlier. So many Philly institutions that you have moved through that are partners of the museum throughout the years. And so we are an arts community that is tight. And so I think you have demonstrated this so clearly, and I'm really grateful for the time we've had with you. Can you leave us with some closing thoughts on
Okay.
what's important to you or what you're working on next?
Where I want to go from here is more experimentation with textile printing.
Mhm.
I would like to get back to wet felting again once I'm able to get some physical therapy that will strengthen me, because it's very tedious and a lot of standing and whatever. Uh, More dye work, and definitely more embroidery. Because see, the embroidery is something that I have to learn more about, how I get the design into the computer in that machine. So I have to still tackle that. Um, I want to travel some more.
Yeah.
I'm itching to travel because Camden, New Jersey looks exotic to me right now. So I'm looking forward to the time when we are out from under this pandemic and I can go abroad, because I really am missing that kind of travel and preparing for it.
Yeah.
When I went to South Africa, I was actually with Brother Godfrey Sitole, who is a Zulu, who was teaching me how to say, I learned how to say 4 phrases really, really well,
Okay.
really well. And I wore everybody else that I came in contact with out with them, because one was the hello, and then what you say when they respond, and thank you. And they were just shocked, because Zulu is not, one of those languages that everybody is trying to speak. And I love the clicks. I
Yeah.
can only do a few, you know, because it's hard to do, but all Black women can do the one that's, and when I told a woman there, I said, all of us can do that, because if something gets on your nerves or you're making a point, I said, we can do that one. We may not have the word right, but we can do that particular one.
Amen to that. Okay, well, I want to again thank you, Betty. I want to thank you for again opening your life and your practice to the
Thank you.
museum. To me, we've had a lot of great conversations over the week as we prepared for this. I want to thank our audience for spending this time with
Oh,
us,
definitely.
for investing both in Betty's practice.
Yeah.
But also investing in the work and the mission of the African American Museum in Philadelphia. So we'll hear a final word from Betty and then we'll go. Thank you, Betty.
Well, this is for a very special person who's a member of your team, who actually called me this morning to wish me well. Hello, Richard Watson. So glad you're on the mend. You don't know how many well wishes and prayers and things went up for you. And I can't tell you how wonderful it was to have your phone call this morning, because I think that really not only encouraged me, but it calmed me down. So thank you, Richard. And I'm looking forward to whenever we see you in your actual physical form again. But, God bless you and we love you.
All right. That has been Art Break, a very special Art Break. Thank you all for being here. Stay safe, and we hope to see you virtually in the near future. And thank you so much. All right.
Thank you. Bye.